Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, wherever you might be. This is Gabe Arnold. I'm a technical director with the DLC. I'll be introducing the webinar here today. I want to thank you all for taking time this Wednesday to listen in here. I assume many of you were with us at our stakeholder meeting in St. Louis last week. So thanks for joining again to talk with us here. So this webinar is to provide an overview of a new policy we have just released. It's a new policy that would allow field adjustable light distribution products to be qualified. There are certain types of these products that have been able to be qualified in the past, but others that were not. And this is an important, I think, a beneficial innovation with products that we're seeing in the market. And so we wanted to develop a policy that would certainly not inhibit these products from being qualified and would also provide a consistent approach to qualifying some of these types of products we've qualified in the past, along with some of these new ones that haven't been able to be qualified until just now. So I'll get into some of the definitions around what this is in a moment. Let me first go through some logistics. So this webinar, as well as the slides, will be posted to our website following the presentation. We will send out links to that information, and so if any of your colleagues miss it or you'd like to reference the slides, you'll be able to do that by going to our website. We have quite a few people on the webinar today. We had about a couple of hundred registered. So that could get unwieldy if we opened up the line. So everyone's going to remain on mute, but we do encourage you and ask you to ask us questions as we go, and you can use the question pane to do that. We're planning to have a live Q&A session at the end with the last 15 minutes where we'll be taking some of the questions received and asking some of our subject matter experts to answer them live. For any questions we don't get to, we'll be following up by email, so please do ask us those questions. And we'll also generally be monitoring things, so let us know, either through the chat pane or the question pane, if you have any technical issues. Here's our agenda real quick. So as I said, my name is Gabe, and I'm doing the introduction here for about 5 minutes. We've got a consultant with Energy Solutions, Greg Barker, who's going to be presenting an overview of the policy. Greg's been providing us technical support and development of this. We're then going to hand things over to Dave Ryan. Dave is going to walk through some application examples. I think one of the things you'll see if you've read this policy and as we go through it here is it can be complex to understand. And so we've done a new thing here where we've actually developed some application examples to assist manufacturers in understanding how to submit their adjustable products to be qualified. There's also some considerations at play for Aimable Products that David will go over. And then we also want to talk about considerations for if you want to update some of your current listings of products to be field adjustable. What that means, how to go about it, what some of the considerations are, and then we'll end with my colleague Bernadette Boudreau, who will be moderating a Q&A session at the end. So let me start with a brief introduction here. So what is this? These field adjustable products are products where you can adjust the distribution in the field. This offers a number of benefits, economies of scale for the supply chain, where you can now have a single product that can do what used to require several different products or different model numbers of products. They also provide more flexibility for customers and installers. This can provide benefits for a installer or a customer being able to actually adjust the distribution of light once it's installed to better meet the needs of the task or the application. And we're seeing more of these products becoming available. I actually want to poll you in a minute to get a little bit more insight into that in terms of how many of these we may be seeing. The formal definition, at least the top level that's written into the policy itself is these are lamps, luminaires, or retrofit kits whose light distribution can be altered from the default factory as shipped configuration. And you can see some examples of those products on the slide. I'll talk through these briefly. So the one on the upper left, this is a product that's got these light bars, and they are rotatable. So you could adjust them in the field. Let's say it's a high bay luminaire. It could work in a general warehouse application. It could also work in an application where you had aisles and you wanted to direct the light more straight down in the aisles. This second fixture, similar. You've got rotatable light bars. This is actually a parking garage fixture, and you can adjust the way these are aimed to best suit the needs of the application. This one on the upper right is actually a lamp product. Some people call this the flower light. And in the closed position, you can see it might work well in maybe a post-top retrofit luminaire, decorative. And in the open position, it might work well, let's say, in HID high bay luminaire, where you can aim those bars down straight at the floor. Down on the lower left, this is actually a zoomed-in view of a street light or an area luminaire. And this product has these field rotatable lenses, so you can rotate them in the field to best meet the needs of the exterior area that you're illuminating. So you now have one product that might be able to provide multiple distributions, where these used to be different products. This one in the middle, bottom middle, this is a aimable track light. And you know, the DLC is always qualified aimable track lights, and you've got this point of adjustment here. But I think what's a little bit different here is these products here is you can actually adjust the beam spread. So that's a form of adjustable light distribution, and this can be done either, you know, some of these products actually have an integral adjustment. Maybe it's a knob you turn or some sort of slider that would allow you to adjust this. But also under the scope of this policy would be a product that might be shipped with 3 different lenses that can be changed in the field. That's something we call standard adjustable. So we'll talk through that in a moment. And then the one on the lower right is last year's Most Innovative Product Award winner from Light Fair. I don't fully understand the science behind this one, but it's got some sort of really cool optic on it, where you can apply a voltage and it will change the beam spread or the distribution of light without any mechanical moving parts. So that's a very cool, innovative product. And these are just examples of the types of products that are eligible under the scope of this policy, and we expect we're going to be seeing more innovation in this area and more types of products like this. I want to talk about some of the debate and deliberations that we had in developing this policy. This was a tough one. We actually went through 3 drafts, had a lot of calls with commenters on the approach we were taking here. We started with what's shown on the left on the green, with an approach where we were requiring the products to meet the DLC requirements at 1 adjustment setting. And you know, we were really trying to develop a policy here that didn't add a lot of testing burden, would be simple to understand. And that's really what drove us to this initial policy proposal. And what we heard from several of the manufacturers as we worked through the drafts on this is that they were uncomfortable with some of the gaming that could occur with that approach that might put them at maybe a disadvantage to other products on the list. Let me give you an example of that. If we developed an approach as described here, where the products only needed to demonstrate that they met the DLC requirements for efficacy and everywhere else at only 1 adjustment setting, there could be a product where at some obscure adjustment setting where that product would be very unlikely to ever be installed in the field, they would be able to demonstrate that they met the requirements. And maybe it's for a particular product category where that product would be very unlikely to ever be applied or installed. And that was really the gaming concern, is that there could be some products that would really try and take advantage of some of the openings here and get that product qualified, even though in the most common applications or settings in which it would be installed, it wouldn't actually be able to meet the DLC requirements. So that really drove us to the approach that you see on the right, which is what we've ended up with, and had near unanimous support from the manufacturers that provided comments on this, and that we're requiring these products to demonstrate that they meet the DLC requirements at all adjustment settings or positions, with exception to ZLD, to the zonal lumen distribution. But every other DLC requirement, they have to demonstrate they meet it. This introduced a lot of complexity to the policy. We can't, it wouldn't be really feasible or reasonable to require manufacturers to test the product at every possible adjustment setting to demonstrate that they meet it. So we've had to apply an approach that the DLC has taken in other areas, where you have to identify a sort of worst case adjustment position and demonstrate that that meets the DLC requirements. Now, coming up with that worst case adjustment position is technically challenging. It can be technically challenging. And especially when you take a product that starts to layer on some of the other innovations that we're seeing in the market. So a product that has field adjustable light distribution, it's also color tunable, it's also got field adjustable light output, all really great innovations, things we want to support. You layer those on top of one another and try to come up with what the worst case settings and characteristics are. That can get pretty challenging to do. And so to address that, we've developed a number of application examples that we hope will help people understand how to get through that and qualify these products. So one more quick thing before I hand things over to Greg Barker to talk through the policy itself is I'd like to do a quick poll here. We're looking to understand a little bit more about how much of a trend these products are in the market, how many more we might see. So I want to ask you, do you have any of these products, or do you intend to submit any of these products to be listed by the DLC? All of your responses in this will remain entirely confidential. We won't be sharing them. Let me go ahead and launch that real quick. There. I'll just give that about 30 more seconds so I can see I'm already over my allotted time for my section. Okay, looks like the numbers are settling out. So thank you very much, everybody. I'll go ahead and close that. And Greg, I will hand things over to you.
Great, thanks, Gabe. Well, Gabe gave a sort of setup to the complexities of this policy. I'm going to run through what's in the policy and hopefully make it sound as simple as possible. So we, and you've seen this in previous webinars on field adjustable light distribution, defined two types of FALD product. FALD, our acronym for field adjustable light distribution, within the sort of overall definition. In our final policy, we have aligned the policy, so it treats these two types similarly, but I think it's helpful for running through your head, and then particularly the 49% of you that indicated you had this type of product in, you're considering it. It helps you run through how does this policy apply. So the upper Integral FALD products are those that are adjusted by moving a part, or as Gabe mentioned, put an electrical voltage that might adjust the optical properties of a part that is integrated into the product. Got that example on top of that flower lamp again. But rotating light bars, LED primaries that would turn on and off also apply here. And the bottom is standard component products, where we are defining those as products where multiple parts are shipped, and the installer, the customer, has the choice about which component, or maybe no component at all, to add on in the final installation. And note this last part does not apply for optional components. So standard is an important part of this term. A product would qualify for FALD if it is always shipped with the set of optional reflectors. But if that's an optional add-on part, that's not qualifying for the FALD policy. And the optional part would be a sort of additional listing on the QPL. Let's go ahead, Gabe. And here on eligibility, DLC's approach, we want to emphasize the benefit of adjustable distributions to customers and the manufacturers. And we're trying not to prescribe, the distribution variations here. So you see that in the first bullet. If your market demands a high bay, to give a bizarre example, perhaps, that is capable of focusing all its light at one point directly underneath it. In addition, it would be capable of a more typical high bay light distribution, then that product is eligible for listing. It would meet the zonal lumen distribution at one light distribution setting, and it would be capable of a light distribution setting that was something else entirely. In the second bullet, you seen that result that Gabe was also showing earlier. We're asking FALD products to meet all other DLC technical requirements for their category and primary use designation across the full range of those either integral adjustment settings or the full set of standard components. And those are the typical technical requirements you see listed below. And note that the surveillance testing that may be done on any listed product could happen at the settings that were submitted in the application, but also any other setting or standard component combination. And some similar situation for premium FALD products with the DLC premium classification. Keep moving ahead. So for the testing requirements, we are going to be processing FALD testing requirements according to the family testing rules. And the principle here is that we're going to be looking for a test in the field adjustable light distribution setting that results in the worst case performance value for those performance values listed in the second row of the table there. Under technical requirements. So efficacy, wattage, and lumen output are listed as the light characteristics. Those could all appear in the same. The worst case value for efficacy, wattage, and lumen output might all coincide in one light distribution setting, in which case one LM79 test is appropriate. In certain cases, they could happen at 3 different light distribution settings, and in that case, you would need 3 LM79s. So we're taking the overall approach of looking, as with other DLC policies, to set a firm floor on performance for these typical metrics. But Ideally, and in many cases we believe the testing report will be required should be on the low end of these ranges rather than the high end. So similarly, the electrical characteristics, if the worst case power factor and total harmonic distortion are not captured in one of the LM79 test reports, that would be an additional bench test. And the thermal characteristics reports, that may be 1 or 2 in situ temperature measurement tests, depending on whether it's DLC premium or just DLC standard. Moving ahead, the certainly we realize that there are a few scenarios here as we've described the integral type and the standard component type of FALD. They can of course occur in the same product as well, and we've kind of tried to run through these scenarios and more on a table, a sort of quick guide. We're not showing the whole table because it stretches out quite long vertically for these 5 scenarios, and this is part of our policy document on the website. Can link to that under the policy development portion of the solid state lighting QPL. Go ahead, Gabe. Now there are a few items specific to field adjustable light distribution that we need on an application for the DLC to review and add the product to the QPL with the right listing. So we are looking for the instructions about how the light distribution is adjusted. Is it a Phillips screw to the some sort of adjustment made by a screwdriver? Is it an electrical voltage? Is it a remote control? Where do the standard components attach or detach? And that's just simple text so that we understand what it is we're looking at and reviewing. Second is we're looking for a description of the adjustable setting position or the components that were used for each of the worst case tests you submitted on that list 2 slides back. And a simple written statement about why that position represents the worst case. Hoping to keep that simple, and I think in many cases those would be intuitive, but we are looking to just simply have that in our application records. Last here is multiple IES files may be submitted with one family application. And we're looking to understand not every possible light distribution, but of course one light distribution which corresponds to each family member. And so that we're asking for a match from the IES files submitted with the application to each member of the family. And we have set up a template which we're showing you a top of here so that that's easy to collect and applicants understand what we're looking for. Okay, last slide. This shows how we'll be listing field adjustable light distribution products on the QPL. So to start with, we're keeping to DLC's general principle of considering listings based on their worst case efficacy. So the displayed values on the QPL for light output, efficacy, and wattage will be those at the distribution setting that corresponds to worst case efficacy. The second bullet point here, we're going to use the max tested wattage field that applies to some of our other policies to display the highest power consumption setting at any field adjustable setting. And we understand that many field adjustable distribution settings won't affect power, but we want to know when it does. The third is a new QPL field, the adjustable distribution setting, something we want to collect as a simple description of the configuration that was tested and designated to comply with the zonal lumen distribution requirements for the PUD. Now that sounds a little complicated, but understand that to go back to one of Gabe's earlier examples, a high bay product might adjust its distribution to meet the ZLD requirements for an aisle product, high bay aisle luminaire, or a general high bay luminaire with a wider beam. And so the product might be submitted with two IES files meeting the zonal lumen distribution requirements for each PUD separately. And, maybe that is designated as, aisle beam and, general high bay beam or broad beam in the technical literature for that product. We'd want to have that description there as the adjustable distribution setting. And bottom is a mock-up of how the product features will appear on the QPL listing in the as integral or standard component, or integral and standard component under the field adjustable light distribution tab, or field within the product feature tab. Great. I'm sure that probably generated some questions, and we're definitely looking forward to taking your questions at the end. We're going to try to run through a few examples first to show you how this really fits together, recognizing the examples are going to be the tricky part, but hopefully this makes more sense. So I'm going to hand over to Dave Ryan of DNR International.
Hi there, Greg, and thanks everyone for joining. So as Gabe mentioned earlier on, sort of understanding and respecting the newness and the complexities of this policy, DLC has developed examples for 6 particular scenarios, and those will be posted on the DLC website on the FALD policy page shortly. If they're not up already, they will be probably in the next day or so. Here on the webinar, we're going to go over the 3 of those scenarios that are the most common in terms of what we expect and in some of the feedback we got during the development rounds. And the examples are somewhat contrived, trying to balance a scenario that's simple enough to follow while having enough specificity and richness and detail to highlight some of the wrinkles and interesting situations that arise out of the policy with how it's been developed and deployed. So for the first scenario here, we're going to consider a product which has field adjustable light distribution functionality controllable by integral means. So let's imagine a product generally intended for a high bay type scenario where the beam can adjust. And that adjustment is done via some remote controller, which perhaps adjusts drive current to particular LEDs in the luminaire, which are each associated with particular optics, and ultimately results in a product which can achieve 2 different beam spreads. Let's imagine that this luminaire is intended to serve sort of 2 distinct end uses in the field, one for general high bay applications and another specifically for high bay aisle applications. So for purposes of this scenario, let's also imagine that the manufacturer and applicant to the DLC would like this luminaire to be listed in both of those applicable primary use designations corresponding with how they intend the product to be used. So there's a little graphic cartoon trying to describe what the beam adjustment is. And then the scenario describes an assumed performance of this product. So if beam 1 is the narrower setting intended for the aisle lighting applications, let's assume that that's ever so slightly less efficient than the beam 2 setting, wider setting intended for non-aisle applications. So if we take this as a premise, we'll see how it works through in terms of what's required for testing, what's required for submission, and ultimately how the product would end up getting listed. So if we can click to the next slide, for this scenario, the FALD policy stipulates that the LM79 testing has to occur on the setting where the product is performing at worst case. And there are multiple worst cases to consider. Here, for simplicity, they're basically all aligned, right? The beam 1 setting is slightly less optically efficient, and therefore it will be the lowest light output setting and the lowest efficacy setting. So the LM79 testing that needs to support the submission and qualification of this product would need to be done at the beam 1 setting. For simplicity, let's also assume that that beam 1 setting is slightly hotter for the hottest LED in the product, and therefore is worst case thermally. That setting would then also need to be tested for ISTMT. So the third bullet here is what would be needed for the IES files in the submission. And again, where the scenario is that the applicant, the manufacturer, would like this product listed in both the high bay aisle and the high bay non-aisle primary use designation, there need to be IES files provided that support that this product can meet the zonal lumen distribution requirements of each of those primary use designations in at least one setting. So if we can assume that beam 1 only passes the aisle setting and beam 2 only passes the non-aisle requirements, then IES files for both settings would need to be provided. As Greg mentioned, we'd also be asking for a correlation document so that there's clarity from the applicant in stating directly which IES file demonstrates compliance or is intended to demonstrate compliance with which primary use designation. So that would be the basic expectation of the submission in this scenario. There are a couple of contingencies that I wanted to note. First is if the LM79 did not capture the worst case power quality condition because it was focused on worst case light output and worst case efficacy, and perhaps there would be a difference in input voltage for the power quality condition, then we would need a separate electrical testing for that power quality condition. That could theoretically be provided at any setting of the beam as long as the electrical conditions were appropriate. Second is if the LM79 in support of light output and efficacy did not include color properties, perhaps, for example, if the LM79 was done with goniophotometry and didn't include color properties, then we would need LM79 testing on the color properties as well. But the policy does specifically call out that the color properties can be provided at any setting of the product. It does not need to necessarily be correlated with the worst case efficacy setting, for example. So if you happen to have a sphere test on a different setting at the right color condition, we could accept that in the application as well. And then the last note here, if you're familiar with the ZLD requirements between the high bay and the high bay aisle, they overlap quite a bit. So if there is a condition where one IES file demonstrates compliance with the ZLD requirements for all of the PUDs involved in the application, one IES file would be sufficient, or only one IES file would be required in that application. It does have implications on how the product gets listed, but that in principle would also be sufficient. So if we go to the next slide, in addition to the written narratives of each of the examples that are being posted to the DLC website, there is an associated template application form showing what the application form would be expected to include for that given scenario. So for this application form, I've narrowed or hidden the columns that are not really applicable to the FALD situations to highlight some of the details on what we'd be expecting in the application form, which translate then over to how the product would end up getting listed on the qualified product list. So the first thing that I want to note is the vertical red arrows for light output, efficacy, and input power. So all performance values on the QPL are required to be consistent with that worst case test condition that's provided in the application. And so therefore, for this product, even though it's applying for two different primary uses, and in principle, it's expected that those primary uses would operate at different beam settings, the listed performance information for this product would be the same. They would be consistent with that worst case setting. So in this situation, beam 2 wouldn't be represented in the scaled light output efficacy or input wattage values directly. The second, the blue arrows that are at an angle, those are noting that the column for AI, that is the adjustable distribution setting column, would need to note at which setting the IES file was provided, demonstrating that the product met the ZLD requirements for that primary use designation. So as noted in the previous slide, assuming that both IES files are provided here, beam 2 is correlated with the high bay luminaire PUD, and beam 1 is correlated with the high bay aisle PUD. The rows match up with the column for the specialty or the primary use designation and the adjustable distribution setting. If theoretically only one IES file were provided, then that call out in the adjustable distribution setting would have to be consistent with whichever setting that IES file represents. And the last thing to note here is there is a column AN off to the right on the application form where we are asking for max wattage. In this particular scenario, that's not different than the base wattage, but if that does happen to be different for your particular product, it'll need to be noted in that field. All right, so if we move on to the next slide, the second scenario that we wanted to walk through is similar, but rather than the manufacturer applying for listing on the DLT QPL in both the high bay and high bay aisle primary use designations, now let's imagine this same product where the manufacturer only wants the product to be listed in the high bay luminaire application, primary use. That is, they don't desire a listing in the high bay aisle primary use designation. Same performance information, same products, but different listing desires from the manufacturer. So moving to the next slide, what this example highlights is even though the listing is only going to be requested in the high bay luminaire primary use designation, because that beam 1 setting is worst case, the testing will still be required on that beam 1 setting for LM79 and for ISTMT. Similar to the previous scenario, the IES file has to be provided that correlates with the primary use designation. For simplicity in this example, we assume that that be provided on beam 2 because beam 2 will meet the primary use that it's applying for, that non-aisle high bay primary use designation. The same contingencies here apply as on the previous scenario. Depending on what you're testing for LM79 and ISTMT already include, it is acceptable for the power quality and the color metrics to come from other tests that you may have on hand. And then again, if the beam 1 setting happened to meet the ZLD requirements for the high bay luminaire primary use, that would be acceptable. We're just highlighting an example here, assuming that you would need beam 2. So now if you move to the next slide, the application form here is somewhat similar, but obviously includes only one listing and only at the high bay luminaires for commercial and industrial buildings of primary use designation. To note on the red vertical arrows here, all the performance values still need to be consistent with that worst case test condition. So here it's the condition and the performance at the beam 1 setting, even though, again, in this scenario, the manufacturer may only be interested in qualifying the product in that beam 2 intended end use. All right, So if we move to the next slide, the third scenario here is assuming a standard component field adjustable light distribution product. And to reiterate what Greg described about this earlier, this is a product where a single model number, a single ordering code includes more than one option, quote unquote, in the box that can be installed or potentially even changed out after installation in the field, right? This is not a scenario where the two lenses are called out with two unique model numbers. This is a scenario where they're both the same model number, right? So let's imagine a product here that's a luminaire, comes with two lenses or trim kits, one intended for semi-cutoff end uses and one intended for full cutoff end uses. And the end user or installer at the point of installation can decide which of those two lenses they install on the product. For this scenario, let's imagine that the manufacturer would like this luminaire listed both in the DLC primary use designations for full cutoff wall-mounted area luminaires and the one for non or semi-cutoff wall-mounted area luminaires. The table below assumes a basic set of performance information that we can then build the rest of the scenario to describe what testing that this applicant would potentially need to qualify these products. So if we move to the next slide, in this situation, because lens B or the product as installed with lens B is worst case light output, worst case efficacy, highest wattage, and is assumed to be, in this case, the highest temperature setting, or highest temperature condition rather, all of the testing needs to take place on this product with lens B installed. With the two different primary use designations that the product is intending to qualify under, we anticipate a requirement that IES files for both of those settings would need to be provided. And as noted before, a correlation document between the IES file and which primary use designation that IES file is intended to correlate to. The same contingencies apply to this scenario as with the integral product. If the ELM79 and IES-TMT of formal testing here don't include the power quality or information that can come from electrical tests otherwise, and if the color properties are done via an ELM79 with a different lens installed, it is acceptable to take the color information from that other configuration. It doesn't have to be exactly the same configuration as was done for light output efficacy or wattage. So now moving to the next slide, how would the application form on this look? It is similar in many respects to the integral scenario, but to call out specifically the scaled light output, scaled efficacy, and scaled input power, those vertical red arrows, are pointing out that although they're in two different primary use designations, and even though the in-field performance, if it were installed with a lens intended for that end-use application, would be slightly different, because of the listing principle that DLC has in place, that the listing performance values have to be consistent with the test condition. Both of these listings end up with the same rated performance information, and both would actually end up with the same tested performance information correlated to that worst case test condition. The column AI for adjustable distribution setting is the setting at which the IES file is provided that demonstrates that the product with that configuration, with that lens, meets those unillumined requirements of the primary use designation indicated in column B. So those things have to correlate with one another. And again, in a situation where the maximum wattage is different, that needs to be called out in column AN over to the right of the application form. All right, so if we move to the next slide, I've seen a lot of questions have come in on that. I'm sure we'll go through those during the Q&A period. But all of these examples and 3 additional ones are being posted on the DLC website. There's a written narrative and a application form that goes through in much more detail the particular scenario, what's required for testing, what's required for submission, what the anticipated application fees would be, and how that product would end up being listed on the qualified products list. So in addition to the 3 scenarios that I went through, which again for recap were an integrally adjustable product submitting for multiple primary uses, an integrally adjustable product submitting for 1 primary use, and a standard component adjustable product submitting for multiple primary use designations. There are 3 other examples. There's a standard component product intended for multiple uses, which is only applying for 1 primary use designation listing. And then there are 2 scenarios trying to highlight the stack up between the new FALD policy and some existing policies that the DLC had previously had. One scenario describing a product which is both integrally adjustable and has field adjustable light output functionality, assuming that product wanted to submit in 1 specific primary use designation, what the requirements would be for testing and submission and evaluation and listing of that product. And then a final scenario describing a product which is both a field adjustable light distribution product, which changes its distribution via integral means, a product that has field adjustable light output, and a product which is white tunable, and what that product would have to do in terms of testing, submission information, testing costs, and then how it would be listed on the QPL. So again, you'll be able to find all those on the website, and as you read through them in preparation for your applications, you're very much encouraged, if you have questions, to reach out to us at applications@designlife.org. All right, so the next section is, if you've read the policy, there is some language in there in regards to aimable products. So previously, products with aimable heads, aimable apertures, products which were directional and where the beam could be directed in more than one orientation relative to the environment, those products have always been eligible. Certain primary uses like flood and spot categories, it's normal for that to be a product feature. And then in certain other primary use designations, most notably the area lighting applications, it's not uncommon, but was historically paired with a position restriction on how that product was qualified in the notes field on the DLC QPL. So these products are still eligible, but we are, for consistency purposes, asking that they be submitted as field adjustable light distribution products, understanding that a movable beam changes where the light is going and therefore is a type of adjustable distribution. The goal with us incorporating it into this FALD policy was to not add any additional burden on these products. They were historically eligible. They will continue to be eligible, and so we didn't want to make it incrementally more difficult in our effort to align the consistent approach between different types of field adjustable distribution. So if you go through all of the details of the policy, then what you'll hopefully realize, and we're happy to walk through this with you on your individual applications as needed, but ultimately the testing requirements required of these products and what the review, the technical review entails, are unchanged from what the status quo was prior to the FALD policy coming into effect on March 7th. There are some paperwork differences, some documentation differences, but we're hoping that those are net the same effort. It'll just take a little bit of transition for folks to get used to the new requested information in the right columns and the explanations provided. We previously were asking for this information, but it was in a slightly different format, and so it's a change in the administrative documentation. There are 2 key parts of this new administrative documentation, and one is that FALD products all require a quote-unquote technical justification for what the worst case condition is. We do want these products that are aimable to provide that, but it can be as simple as noting that it is an aimable product that does not have for example, a dynamic beam spread. It's got a single beam spread, and therefore the product is not expected to change in its performance as that head is pointed in different directions. That would be an acceptable technical justification. And then the second piece here is in that field adjustable distribution setting column. We just want folks to note what the orientation is in the IES file that we're looking at to make that a little bit cleaner in our review. This would pop up occasionally historically as a point of confusion that needed clarification. So with that directly being stated, we hope that simplifies the review process slightly. All right, so moving to the next slide, the last section here is the provisions around updating. So most notably with the Aimable products that we just talked about, but in edge cases on certain other historical interpretations and decisions that DLC had been made, there were certain types of products which historically had been eligible, which are now folded under the FALD policy. So DLC in the policy rollout on the 7th noted some very specific rules regarding the updating process for these products to update to FALD designations on the QPL. And so the first clarification here is that at least currently, any product that was previously submitted prior to the FALD policy is not affirmatively required to update to an FALD designation. It may update if it would like to, but manufacturers are not required to update if they don't want to go through that updating process. Again, at least for the time being. That said, if those products come back to update for other purposes, and the most common use cases for updating would be if nomenclature has changed and you're trying to execute a nomenclature update on your product, or if you've had a design change that affects performance. For example, you've perhaps upgraded to a new LED and you want the improved performance of that product to be noted on the QPL. So if you come back to update for those purposes, you are not required to update to FALD at that point, although you'd be encouraged to do so. But if you choose not to update to the FALD designations at that point, we will add a note to the notes field just to note that the product is considered an adjustable distribution product, but since it was historically qualified before this product came into effect, that it's not noted as such in that relevant column. The last bullet here is, although you're not required to update to FALD, there are provisions for updating if you desire to do so. If you would like to update, you're encouraged and provided a pathway to updating your products to FALD. And there's really sort of two contingencies within this pathway. If there are no new tests required, that is, if the historical testing you did on your product is sufficient via the new FALD policy, then the only thing that really needs to be done is an administrative sort of paperwork type update, making sure that we have the right application form, making sure that it's noted with the right values in the right columns to translate over to the database, and therefore update your listing on the public-facing website. So for those types of products, there's an administrative fee to cover that paperwork update, and that's dependent on the size of the number of the products in the group that you are updating. And that fee schedule is consistent with the historical updating fee schedule for dimming purposes, if you're familiar with that fee schedule. Any product that was not previously represented as field adjustable in its distribution and is coming back to say, hey, we've perhaps made a design change to allow this product to change its distribution in the field, that will very likely require new testing. And so anything that requires new testing, the normal testing review fees in the family grouping fee structure would apply. So that is, any new test report that DLC would have to review would be associated with a $500 test report review fee for those particular products in that particular pathway. If you have products or questions on your particular application, as always, we're very happy to walk through that with you one-on-one. And you're encouraged to reach out to applications@designlights.org. Send us your product IDs, send us your family grouping ID, tell us what change, if any, you've made to your product, and please provide the spec sheet, and we can work through with you on what you would need to do to update your product. All right. So I believe that's the last content slide there. I will turn it back over to Gabe or Bernadette for emceeing.
All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for participating in the webinar. And we have a few questions that we've answered in the Q&A. Just to let you guys know, yes, this presentation will be available after the webinar. You will have access to that link. We have 3 questions right now that are flagged for follow-up here. And I'm going to start with the first question that was submitted by Alexa Lambert. And Alexa's question is, for field adjustable distribution linear ambients that are essentially the same as non-adjustable linear ambients, but are just put on a rotational arm, does all family testing need to be redone since the field adjustable models need to be submitted separately? Or can field adjustable applications reference non-field adjustable options?
Great. Dave, do you want me to start with that and you pick up? I'm not hearing Dave, so this is Greg Barker. I'll jump in. Some of the testing, assuming that, it's hard to say all family testing would need to be redone because there should be a lot of the testing reports that might apply. For example, if depending on the similarities between the field adjustable model and the non-field adjustable model, some of the same test reports might apply from one to the other. I would also note about the question about it being redone, as Dave covered later after you sent this, not all listed products are being required to update to this FALD policy at this time. So there's a chance that that testing doesn't need to be redone until a new family or a new application is ready for submission. And please follow up with us, Alexa, if we can help clarify.
Okay, hopefully that answers the question. If there's any additional follow-up needed, as Greg and Dave said, you can always reach out to us for more explanation on your particular product or situation. We have one more question that was flagged, and the question is, what if field adjustable distribution luminaires also have a field adjustable output? Does the testing still need to only happen at the highest output setting?
So correct. Yeah, go ahead, Dave.
Okay, I'd be happy to take that one. So hopefully this is one of those areas where the examples that we've developed and are being posted will help. There is an example that will speak directly to a situation where the product has both field adjustable light distribution features and field adjustable light output features. So the policy states that in the situation where you're both FALD and FALO, the product would need to meet the testing requirements of both policies. So FALO requires the product to be tested in its highest output setting. If that is not the setting in terms of the FALD options, the distribution setting options, if the highest light output setting is not the worst case efficacy setting, then additional testing would need to be done to satisfy the FALD parts of that policy, right? So I think the direct phrasing was, would it still only need maximum output testing? And the answer is it depends on your particular product, but very likely not. That word only, it's very likely that it would need an additional test, assuming that the different distribution settings led to slightly different performance.
Okay. Hopefully, once again, that addressed the question that was presented. And if there's any additional clarification on your specific application, please feel free to reach out. We have one last question that has just recently come through, which is, as we use a line in Excel for each beam, do we pay $25 for each beam test?
Yeah, so the family grouping structure remains, right? So if you have distinct model numbers for each beam, right, for each beam setting, if those are desired to be listed on the QPL separately, or if they are separate products with different beams, then any additional family members would apply to that additional family member fee. If it's an adjustable beam under one model number, that is, there's not separate model numbers for them, then the family grouping structure still applies, but without those additional lines, those additional fees don't come into effect.
Okay. Well, it looks like we are at time for the webinar. I see that there were a couple of questions that have come in, and what we will do is follow up directly with you on those questions. And as we've stated before, please feel free to reach out to us on your specific application or update, and we can offer more clarification on your specific application or product. And Gabe, I don't know if you wanted to wrap up or have any final comments on the webinar.
No, I think that's it, Bernadette. Thank you everyone for joining, and like Bernadette said, we will follow up with the questions that weren't answered, and don't hesitate to reach out. Have a good day.